Hi folks, Will at LR Workshop. This glorious array of parts you see before you are the parts required to convert a Defender from left-hand drive to right-hand drive, at least for the 2002 to 2006 model year era, but a lot of these parts will be applicable to other years of Defenders as well. These parts came from a 2006 right-hand drive 300 TDI that was converted to left-hand drive. And I'm going to go through all these parts and just explain so you can see in detail the parts required, because it becomes quite a common question on forums now and then about what's required to be changed as part of the process. And there's always a number of parts in here that are a bit more surprising you wouldn't necessarily think of up front. So hopefully this video will help to detail those for you. Now I would say that this conversion here is probably one notch down from the factory perfect replication of the opposite side steering to the one that you're converting. In this instance, the bulkhead and the seat box weren't replaced, and those are probably the things you would replace if you're doing it to exactly factory parts, but instead those parts were modified. I would say this is very much a pragmatic conversion, because having to replace the seat box and bulkhead would have added a whole load of extra time and cost. This was done by a reputable company in the UK. But what I would say is there weren't any corners cut. This is, as I said, a very pragmatic way of doing it if you want as close as possible to factory usage of parts without spending top dollar. So anyway, I'm just going to go through the parts from front to back. They're all laid out as they would be on a Defender, more or less, so you can get an understanding of what you would need to replace on a Defender. The general advice goes on the forums when people say I want to convert my Defender steering, people usually say sell it and then buy one of the opposite or the correct steering that you require. That doesn't always take into account the emotional attachment you may have to a vehicle, so sometimes this is totally necessary. So hopefully what you can get from this video is that it is an achievable job, and this will hopefully help you price up your expectation of the kind of parts you'll need to replace. Starting off here, we've got headlights, because naturally they dip down to a different side depending on which side of the road you're driving on. Steering components are probably the most obvious thing you would change. This is the panhard rod bracket that bolts to the chassis, and because it's cranked it means that it's handed different sides. And then naturally the steering box. I've left this one in a bag because it's oily. This is the end of the drag link. I believe it's called a cross eye. And then the panhard rod, the left-hand drive one, has got a crank in it from 2002 onwards. The right-hand drive one is straight. Now this was a Defender with aircon. If you don't have aircon, you don't have to change these parts. But because it's had aircon, this is basically the most parts you would have to replace on any Defender of this era. These are the aircon pipes on a 300 TDI, and there are 5 of them, of which one is common between right-hand drive and left-hand drive. So you've got to change 4 pipes basically, and these are them. And then also there's the bracket for the receiver dryer, because it gets bolted to the opposite side of the chassis rail because it goes where the steering box would go otherwise. We've got power steering pipes need replacing because the reservoir swap sides, the steering box swap sides, but the power steering pump stays on the engine in the same position. So there's 3 of those on a 300 TDI. Moving down the left-hand side, we've got the heater matrix, which is fairly obviously needs to be changed, and then also this intake here, which comes from under the wing. And then there's the heater hoses that go from the engine into the heater matrix. And then brake pipes have got to change because the master cylinder changes sides. This is the pipe that goes across the back of the engine bay on the bulkhead. Then we've got the other brake pipe from the master cylinder to the right-hand side wheel well. And this one goes from the master cylinder to the rear brake pipe, which stays on the same side of the chassis no matter which side the steering's on. This is the clutch slave cylinder pipe. So because the clutch master cylinder will change sides with the pedal, the slave cylinder doesn't. So on a left-hand drive 300 TDI, the pipe has to go around the back of the engine bay on the bulkhead. The wiper arms, because they swish a different direction because the drive's on a different side, but the holes are already in the bulkhead, so you just have to move the rubber grommets and the wiper wheel boxes as well. On the 300 TDI is the brake vacuum hose that has to get routed round to the brake servo. And here is the accelerator cable. Let's go around to the driver's side. So this is where the driver would be sitting on a right-hand drive. Most of the dashboard does have to be replaced, but a lot of the bits are common, so you don't need a full dashboard change of parts. You can keep the binnacle and everything, but you do need to change the heater controls and the cover and the heater control cables. And here is the bottom bracket of the binnacle. Now this is handed because technically the Speedo instrument panel is also handed because the Speedo is normally closest to the centre, but it doesn't make that much difference. You could retain the instrument binnacle in the conversion. This dashboard's got aircon, so the lower dash panel here needs to go into the opposite footwell, and also the lower dash panel it attaches to, because the steering wheel goes to the other side, along with the opposite corner of the dashboard and the grab handle. You also need to swap the backing plate and the fascia panel, but you can keep the brackets that sit between this panel and the fascia panel behind the radio. The vent flap levers also carry across and also does the central fascia switch panel. The big thing to talk about is wiring. Now you have to put a lot of thought into thinking, well, why can't I just swap the bulkhead from one side to the other? Why don't you just flip the bulkhead wiring loom around? You've got the instruments on one side, the wiper motor on the other, why don't you just swap them? One of the problems is the wing loom connectors aren't the same. This, on the right hand side, is a 10-way connector. And on the left hand side it's a 14-way, it's got different wires going in. This would change sides because it's the heater connector, but the main wing connector wouldn't. And then this is the wiper motor that would swap sides. A lot of the stuff on the right hand side does switch over because it's got the brake fluid warning switch, it's got the brake light switch. But again, one thing that doesn't switch sides is the roof loom that goes up the right hand side, although you could probably get around that. There's nothing to say it has to go up the right hand side. And this bulkhead header joint stays on the right hand side because there is a stud for it on the bulkhead, but you could conceivably get around that. And then there's the part of the loom that goes to the battery box that comes down the left hand side of the gearbox and up over the top of the transfer box. That would have to stay on the same side, but it comes out of the left hand side of the bulkhead loom, not the centre. And there's the chassis connectors, they all go down the right hand side and they come out on the right hand side of the loom. You wouldn't want to swap those to the other side. So if you just swapped it around, this right hand side went to the other side, they'd be in the wrong place as well. Same with the engine loom that connects on this side. So really there's a lot more to consider than just flipping the wiring loom round. If you did do it, you'd end up with quite a lot of custom wiring you require, so it really makes sense to consider getting a new bulkhead wiring loom handed for the side of steering that you want on your vehicle. Now in terms of the seat box, the matting's here to represent the seat box. You don't really need to replace the seat box matting. This one's just been done because it's a bit ropey, but just to illustrate, it's the handbrake that needs to change sides, and the handbrake lever and the boot are different themselves. You see the bracket for the lever there is slanted slightly, it would butt up against the gearbox tunnel. So this lever wouldn't work on the other side. And the seat box has the hole in it, so you'd have to drill the hole and then reinforce the seat box on the opposite side. This is where the bulkhead loom comes into the seat box, or it would do onto the right hand side. You don't need to replace the engine loom, which is the same for 300 TDI and Td5. In terms of the bulkhead conversion that would have been required, naturally you've got to cut pedal holes on the other side, the opposite side, and then blank off the ones on the original side. And then you'd have to cut off the bracket for the wiper motor and move that to the other side. After that's done, you're more or less good to go after you've done that on the bulkhead and then the seat box. The rest of it is just all these parts. So there we go. I don't think I've forgotten anything. If I have, then please leave a comment down below. So this is what I would consider to be a minimum parts list required to swap your Defender from left-hand drive to right-hand drive, or vice versa. If you wanted to do it in a pragmatic way that tried to keep as much factory parts as possible, and probably a few modifications as possible as well. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.